Okay, so welcome to the third instalment of the Biology and Left seminar. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Kat Moir. I'm from the University of Sydney and I'm here as a visiting fellow this semester. So I'm convening as a guest this seminar, the German philosophy seminar, which is ordinarily convened by Johann Siebers there. And the topic is Biology in the German Left, which is related to the project that I'm working on for research at the moment. Since we've got a few new people in the room, we'll just do a quick round of names so that everybody knows who everybody is. Artemis, since your name begins with A, do you want to start?
What a coincidence! Beautiful coincidence. I'm Artemis. I'm a cultural historian of the 19th century. I work on music, and I'm a visiting fellow here at SAS.
Hi, I'm Federico. I work on the German Jewish thought of the 20th century, and I'm a PhD student here at the Ernst Center.
Hi, I'm Convenor. I'm from the University of Nottingham and I'm working on the conservative body politic in the Weimar Republic.
Okay, hi, I'm Monica. I'm from the University of Warsaw and I work on the reception of Hegel in Russian philosophy.
Hi, I'm Giza. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Oxford on the relationship between nature and literature in the German-speaking countries in the first half of the 19th century.
Johann Siebers, I'm the director of the Bloch Center here and I work mostly on 19th and 20th century German thought.
My name is Bash. I think I'm probably the only non-academic here, but I'm just interested in philosophy, so I'm here as a member of the public.
Great, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm the member.
Okay.
My name's Moir.
Sorry?
Moir.
Oh, right. Okay, so the topic this week is social/socialist Darwinisms. There was a fair bit of reading that I put up on the blog site, and I did sort of say to people, I encourage you to read as much or as little of it as you want, but we'll focus on Hegel and on this author, Julius Schratzer, who was his student. In previous weeks, I've just kind of introduced the topic and then we've read together a text or some extracts of text. Today I've brought a PowerPoint just to kind of talk through some of the other material that we haven't focused on in the reading, which I thought might be helpful. What I'm interested in here today especially is to think about the different ways in which Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection and some of his ideas also about human heredity got taken up by the political left in Germany and some of the kind of complicated genealogies around that. My rationale for working on this topic in the first place, which I mentioned in the first week that we met, is that there is this sort of idea in the intellectual history literature that looks at the politicization of biology in the German-speaking world through the lens of the Nazi genocide, National Socialist appropriations of social Darwinism and of Völkisch ideology, and so on. And so I'm trying to sort of take a look at the opposite side of the political spectrum and to see how that story worked there. And obviously Darwin and evolutionary theory are big nodal points in that history. So Darwin's main texts are listed there. The Voyage of the Beagle, which is obviously an account of his biological investigations in the Southern Hemisphere, largely. The two more interesting ones for us today that had a more impactful reception in the German-speaking world are On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859, and The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which was published in 1871. When we read Engels a couple of weeks ago, we saw that Engels had got one of those 1,200 copies of The Origin published in English straight away and read it very quickly. But within a year, it had already appeared in German in translation by Heinrich Georg Bronn, who was himself a biologist as well as being a translator. And there are a couple of interesting sort of things to know about the Bron translation, I suppose. One was that he made some particular etonological decisions in translation that would have a kind of a significance for the reception of Darwin's work in Germany. The expression favoured races, which was Darwin's expression, Bron chose to translate as vervollkommnet. Favoured becomes vervollkommnet, so completed or perfected races. And he also, in his translation, in his edition, added an extra chapter at the end of the book in which he essentially interpreted Darwin's evolutionary theory based on his own research and his own sort of theoretical and experimental research. He had come to similar conclusions to Darwin, and so he added an additional chapter which fundamentally sort of repositioned some of the key ideas of evolution in relation to human society. And then The Descent of Man was translated also into German very quickly after it appeared. Now, it's interesting that Darwin obviously recognised that the reception of his work in Germany had been particularly eager and enthusiastic. You know, in his letter to Quatrefages in 1870, he says, "It's really interesting, it's curious how nationality influences opinion. A week hardly passes without my hearing of some naturalist in Germany who supports my views and often puts an exaggerated value on my works." So he recognised that his theory had been taken up particularly enthusiastically in Germany, as opposed to, say, France, where it was rejected or ignored largely initially. I'll say a bit more about Haeckel in a moment, who was the main sort of populariser of Darwin's ideas in Germany. But what's interesting to note is that although today we sort of associate politicised uses of Darwin's theory with as sort of regressive or conservative, support for Darwinism was initially seen as highly progressive from a political point of view. It was mainly liberals and socialists who advocated early on that Darwin had developed a theory of evolution, and particularly human evolution, that was more convincing than the Christian doctrine of creation. And just one also, I think, significant point is that Darwin's theory, when applied to the political realm, could be seen to support both liberal, laissez-faire models of society and collectivist, organicist models of society. And different writers sometimes emphasise different aspects of this, but very often they were both equally sort of part and parcel of the same theory and application. And I think we'll see that in Waldman in particular. So, Ernst Haeckel, who was professor of zoology at the University of Jena, he's sometimes been described as the German Darwin by his contemporaries. He was certainly the most vociferous proselytizer of Darwin's ideas in Germany. And he was also a founder of the civil society organisation, the Monistenbund, which was a sort of philosophically grounded, free-thinking organisation that advocated for pacifism and for scientific values being independent of religious and political imperatives. These are just some of Haeckel's most important texts in the context of thinking about his reception of Darwinism. He wrote a lot of natural scientific literature that was mainly focused on looking at sea creatures, marine organisms. But these are the texts that are important for us to think about. So, Über die Entwicklungstheorie Darwins was the text of a lecture that Haeckel gave to the Stettin Assembly of Scientists and Doctors in 1862, and it's when he sort of comes out as a Darwinist himself. The General Morphology is more of a work of theoretical biology than a popular text, but I name it there just because it is the book in which Darwin coins the term ecology. And obviously that has some bearing on his the development of his monistic philosophy. The Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, which was published in 1868, was the first work in which Haeckel attempted to make Darwinian theory sort of to popularise Darwinian theory for a broader audience. And just like the scientific materialists that we saw a few weeks ago, Haeckel was very much engaged in this sort of popularisation drive in the middle of the 19th century. So, Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte was a mixture of Darwinian ideas and Haeckel's own research findings as an embryologist, and it was the source of a controversy that he became embroiled in, which is known as the embryo controversy, which some people may have already encountered. Here, Haeckel, so in the Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, Haeckel included a number of plates that demonstrated the development of different kinds of embryos, so human embryos at different stages, and argued that, the thesis is that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So the idea was that on the ontogeny of an embryo, so the embryonic development of the biological individual, goes through stages that actually correspond to developmental stages in the species to which that embryo belongs. And he believed that he had proven this, and it was later disproven. But what I think is interesting about that is it already points towards Haeckel's development of his philosophical thinking as a monist. This idea that the microcosm of the individual in some way corresponds to a macrocosmic or ontogenetic, progressively complex development of the living world. The Anthropogeny book in 1874 was a direct kind of response to Darwin's descendants theory, in which Haeckel argued for the inequality of human races and a racial hierarchy he put forward there. So he begins to sort of show himself as a social Darwinist in that work. The Welträtsel is the text that we read an excerpt from, chapter 1. This is really the first articulation of Haeckel's monistic worldview. And then a little bit later, Die Lebenswunder is also a popular scientific work. Kunstform der Natur, everybody I assume will have seen the beautiful drawings of marine organisms that Haeckel made in the Kunstformen. And again, Haeckel's sort of philosophy, there's one right there, for example, that's a really well-known one. Haeckel's philosophy was developed out of his scientific studies, saw the world as a kind of aesthetic creation, essentially, in which every part played a role in a harmonious whole. He was a respected scientist, and he was, the embryo controversy sort of demonstrates that, despite the fact that he got it wrong. He was in dialogue with his contemporaries at a sophisticated level of scientific rigour, but he was gradually discredited because of his increasing sort of espousal of a vitalistic kind of perspective, which culminates ultimately in this idea that non-organic forms can also be beseelt, can have a soul and have the sort of rudiments of consciousness as well, which he articulates in that book, Kristallseele. Okay, so Haeckel's role in this, or place in this story as I see it, is that he really represents a transition from a materialist worldview, so from the kind of material holism of the scientific materialists who we looked at a few weeks ago, Büchner, Moorschott and Vogt, to a kind of monism that is not strictly materialist any longer, yeah? So here, this short quote from Die Welträtsel. Haeckel argues that the later edition of the Welträtsel, he says, der Monismus erkennt im Universum nur eine einzige Substanz, die Gott und Natur zugleich ist. Körper und Geist oder Materie und Energie sind für sie untrennbar verbunden, yeah? So here we get the idea that not only matter and energy are untrennbar verbunden, yeah, inextricably connected, which is the same argument that Büchner makes in Kraft und Stoff, basically, but it's about God and nature, and that is significantly moving away from the materialist's perspective, I think. And we might want to think about what consequences that has for social Darwinism. So there's a big debate about whether Haeckel himself was a social Darwinist. First of all, maybe we can just have a quick think about what people understand by this term social Darwinist. I've got a particular way that I would like us to use it today, or to think about it today, perhaps, but I'd be interested to hear what other people understand by it.
Shall we start with A again?
Why don't we?
Awesome. Federico? No, I don't know. From the little I know from the concept is that it supplied some sort of scientific underpinnings to ideas of, I guess, progress. And how it, in many senses, social, hierarchical, racial progress, and how the species evolved socially. Very deep. Federico? Save me?
Or anybody, I mean, we don't have to...
Anybody save me?
Yeah.
I guess it also kind of puts an emphasis on a society being sort of this self-regulating kind of system, right? So there's not sort of an outside source of what is right and wrong, or what society, what kind of shape society should take, but that there are certain groups and struggles and formations in that society that kind of are engulfed in this progress themselves.
Yeah. I think these are all elements of it.
What I'm trying to understand is, whether it was neutral as a term. That's even from what you explained now. I'm trying to understand for myself whether it was neutral when it emerged. You can discuss that.
And I was just thinking about the concept of struggle for life that put inside a social context. It means that what could be called progress could be achieved only with a clash of individuals or social strata, one against the other, and there's a kind of natural law which grants one individual or one social strata permission to make to go forward.
Yeah.
I think it's also associated, in my mind, it's also associated with a kind of reductive attitude towards social institutions or values or even human experiences.
Yeah.
They're all seen as functions of this self-regulating biological struggle. And in that sense, social Darwinism is one of the big invisible ideologies of today. You know, we almost without thinking talk in those terms. When we talk about evolutionary mechanisms behind our behavior.
I think that's... No, sorry.
No, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, but maybe you could explain it out because I was just wondering while reading the secondary text in this that from what I understood the idea there was that the socialist element of social Darwinists at the beginning was connected to the fact that they accepted Darwinism as a truthful explanation of how progress works, while at the same time they didn't necessarily accept it and wholly, so to say. So I guess like this kind of element of morality and moral regulation of progress was something that struck me, and exactly in connection to what I also used to understand behind this term as this exactly kind of acceptance of how this is not a regulatable thing in a way. So that I was wondering what the early social Darwinists or socialist Darwinists would say about institutions actually.
Yeah. We'll see a little bit of that with Waldman, I think.
Okay.
I can say a little bit about that when we come to him. So was the term neutral? Is the term neutral? I mean, in the literature, I think it is not a neutral term. It's associated with an application of evolutionary theory to human social life that is closely connected to the justification of inequalities and the and a kind of apologism for racial hierarchy and difference. And so I think it's not neutral in the way that it's used in the scholarly literature.
Not now.
Yeah.
I mean, in its own time. Was it?
Also then. Yeah. Also then. It was definitely associated with a view of society pinned to, as Johan said, a reductionist account of human behaviour in biologistic terms that was, how do I want to say that? Non-egalitarian, let's say, non-egalitarian, and closely connected also in intellectual circles with eugenic ideas. So it wasn't neutral then either, but it's not neutral today. Yeah. So the way that I sort of find it most useful to think about social Darwinism is going in the direction, minimalist. So everything that everybody said just now was absolutely part of how I think we all understand it. But I think the key element for me, at least, in this whole story is the reductive aspect. So the explanation of social phenomena as epiphenomena of the biological, simply, as just kind of effects of biological and evolutionary facts. So the question, was Haeckel a social Darwinist? That's not something that we need to sort of try and answer here today. I just brought along, I think it's useful for us to think about it because of the way that he then gets taken up by different figures, particularly Volkmann and Schaxel, who we're going to read from. So I've just put a couple of quotes here from Haeckel, a couple of different works. So this excerpt is from Die Weltwelt, so the first edition, 1899. Would people like me to read it aloud, or is everyone happy to read quietly? Is it helpful if I read it? Good.
Translate it on the spot.
Or
not only the surprising theoretical progress in true natural science, but also its astonishingly fruitful practical application in technology, industry, transport and so on, have given our entirely modern cultural life a completely new form. And then there's been a bit cut off. But also we've, on the other hand, in important areas of intellectual life and social relations, we've made little or no progress in relation to earlier centuries. Often, in fact, unfortunately, we've made considerable regressions. This obvious conflict results in not only an uncanny feeling of internal Zerrissenheit.
The direction.
Direction, thank you. Internal direction. Oh, I want to say also conflict, and Unwahrheit, so untruth, but also the danger of serious catastrophes in the political and social realms. It therefore appears not only as the right thing, but also as a holy duty of every honest researcher imbued with love for humanity to try to resolve this conflict in good conscience and to avoid the dangers and to contribute to avoiding the dangers that result from it, this conflict between scientific progress and regression in the social and political realms. However, I'm convinced that this can only happen through brave striving for knowledge of the truth and, misspelled durch there, through the acquisition of a clear worldview that is solidly based on natural science. Does that make sense? So just maybe we can comment briefly on this. What is the image? What is Hegels saying here? And does this line up with the kind of thing that we think a social Darwinist might say, or not? And if yes, what about it? And if not, what about it? You just have to hold that in your head. I mean, what does this say about his project in this book? Probably worth me just saying a little bit, actually, about this term, Weltbild, and where it comes from. When was it? Let me check.
I mean, he basically wants the social sciences to take inspiration from natural sciences. But what I was wondering about when I was reading this actually first paragraph was kind of the opposition that he draws. That it seems like the culture, like there is like a skeletal split in what in social life that is not just based on biology, let's say, but the cultural life which directly benefits from the inventions of modern science, of natural sciences, while at the same time the social, the political and social realms don't, right? So that there's, I guess that this has to do with maybe this is a hint towards this idea of institutions and how they don't really spring from cultural life as they should in a way. I don't know, but I was wondering like how he deals with this like opposition of like culture and society, and then there's I think at some point he also says that Geist is something that he doesn't really like. I'm just kind of thinking of how to map him on this whole kind of Geist Kultur technique. You know, bundle of possible oppositions that is always so hard to navigate for me. But so that's my question.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that, but I'm going to say something about in response to it, which may help us to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I'm not going to be able to answer it is because I think it's not fully clear in his writing. But so this. remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the mechanical materialists and the argument that they had with the neo-Kantians, so Friedrich Lange and others, who said, okay, you're reducing everything to, you're arguing, the basic claim is that the world is made out of this thing called matter, but what is that? And you know, you don't have access to the in itself of matter, so you're making a philosophical mistake. And there was this whole discussion called the materialism debate, which we touched on, in which the key question, which was how can we explain human consciousness, given that natural science tells us that we live in a world governed by deterministic laws. Towards the end of that discussion, Émile Dubois-Reymond comes in, who was an anatomist, I think, and a chemist, and he makes the argument that you're never going to solve the question of where does consciousness come from. You know, it's not. You can look for transcendental arguments about it or whatever, but it's just one of these, as he called them, 7 world riddles. And he published a book in 1880 called Die sieben Welträtsel, and the relationship between consciousness and the body, mind-body problem, was one of these puzzles that he said we're never going to solve. Now, Haeckel's title, Die Welträtsel, obviously is a response to Dubois-Reymond. What kind of a response is it? Well, that's the question. And the way that Haeckel tries to solve this particular world riddle is through the assertion of monism, which is to say that there is no contradiction between those two things. You know, there is just one unifying substance that runs through the whole of the natural and indeed all other natural world and all other spheres of reality. And so there is this sort of, you know, substantial unity that he's talking about at the heart of all these things. I mean, my response to this quote and to the other places in the excerpt that we looked at where he's sort of talking about this is to see that at some level Haeckel believes that the findings of natural science are relevant for thinking through social and political problems, right? So definitely there's a sense in which here he's arguing that there's a kind of moral obligation of the scientist to advocate for the application of natural science to these social and political and cultural problems somehow. And in the text, as you were pointing out there, Carolina, he does argue for various solutions. I mean, he doesn't really argue. The only one problem that he points to, which he talks about sort of corruption in the judiciary and all these other things, the only one thing that he actually proposed a solution to is the failings of the educational system. And his solution is that they need to learn more biology, basically, at school. I mean, to put it very crudely, but that's sort of what he argues, right? So he's an advocate for educational reform and for the beefing up of natural science education in schools as a way to combat what he sees as sort of, you know, social and cultural decline or problems. I mean, let's just contrast this. Is there anything else that anybody wants to say about this quote?
Well, I think it's very interesting because it fits, from my perception, fits in the climate of the time when he writes the book, this sort of almost unlimited faith in science.
Yeah.
Because he's sort of saying it's not an intrinsic problem with scientific thinking, it's just that we haven't done enough of it, we haven't done it well enough yet, but we need to do more, and then we'll also be able to take this knowledge into the realm of the political or the social, the ethical and the moral.
Yeah.
which is very, I mean, we were just talking, Federico and I were in a class at Middlesex, and we read this bit from Descartes, The Tree of Knowledge, which is the beginning of the scientific revolution, where Descartes says a similar thing. He says that we start with metaphysics, physics is the trunk, and then we have the branches, the various sciences, engineering, mechanics, and the highest, so the furthest reaches of the tree are the knowledge of society and of medicine first, and society, then morality. And he also seems to have this idea that if you start and you do it properly, you build your knowledge up in a scientific way, then you can actually solve moral or social problems in that way.
Yeah.
But for Descartes, that was always this, he was a dualist. There was the consciousness matter split, which apparently, as you said, but for Hegel, he's a materialist, so he has to say, no, it's all one and the same thing. That seems for him to be tied up with the scientific method. Otherwise, it's not scientific, but it's not the case for Descartes earlier on in the scientific era. And Descartes has it much easier than Hegel, because Descartes can say that the basic problem with morality, or the problem with social order, is a problem of the will, and not a problem of reason. And so here you get this monism hides, as it were, to my mind, this fundamental, what a lot of philosophers says is quite fundamental conflict or problematic relationship between will and reason. And here, that will it's a very interesting quotation, because that will becomes subliminal or unconscious. That's just he uses the words duty, holy, sacred duty, and
well, I think
and beseeled. So So I think it's very interesting to see that. Also in relation to Bloch, who of course hated Hegel, and you can see why.
Yes, although, I mean, the sort of, the materialist monism is something that they...
Yeah, they share, exactly, they're so closely connected.
And I think that in the rest of Hegel's writing, you will see something that you recognise as well. I mean, he was basically an ontogeneticist, so he believed that, nature produces increasingly complex forms, and that's something that evolutionarily will continue to happen, which is obviously a theory that's, discredited among biologists now. So there's some kind of, vis vita or vitalist force behind that process for him. So that could be seen as a kind of, a will.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something else about that then. Anyway, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think it's this quote is also interesting because it does clearly show that there is this awareness of how far education can go and where it kind of stops influencing society. Because if there is such an extensive sort of profit from the knowledge produced by natural sciences in such vast areas as technology and industry, as there was at that time, then it's not just a matter of not enough knowledge being distributed in society. And I think in other parts, Hegel really shows then that the problem is that the political sphere and the moral sphere is occupied by the church and by sort of these residues of absolutism. And so it's not just a matter of putting more education out there, but really kind of reforming those institutions or getting rid of them and instead introducing this sort of what he then calls this intramundane God, so
He
not
just
organised.
talks about naturwissenschaftliche Religion, so religion, a scientific religion essentially. So, sorry, I didn't interrupt.
No, that was pretty much it.
He's a bit like the Habermas of his time, isn't he?
I don't know about that. I'm not sure if I think that. In what way do you think that? What makes you say
Well,
that?
so the emotional tone of it is, okay, calm down, let's have a reasonable discussion, see what we can find out, and then we'll organise it to the best of our abilities, and that's the way to go. And
I don't know. I mean, I think he's a pretty skilled rhetorician, and his sort of mobilisation and Virchow's metaphor of the cell state is quite strong. You see him, I mean, he is quite emotive in his writing in other spots, maybe. Anyway, let's have a look at another quote and see how that compares. So this is from a later text, so 1908, where Hegel is sort of defending, in the spirit that Giza just articulated, the freedom of, demanding the freedom of natural science from religious and political principles. I'm just going to read it and then I'll... So he says, at this juncture, we ought not to neglect pointing out how dangerous such an immediate transposition or transfer of natural scientific theories into the realm of practical politics is. The most highly, most highly complex relations of our contemporary cultural life require from the practical or the professional politician such a comprehensive and unbefangen, such comprehensive consideration and such fundamental historical unprejudiced, thank you, and impartial consideration, such a fundamental historical modelling and critical comparison that it can only be undertaken with the greatest caution and reticence. That the practical politician can only dare, with the greatest caution and reticence, to make to apply the laws of nature to the practice of cultural life in this way. So, what is he saying here, and how does that line up with what we sort of saw before, or does it contrast with it? Would you understand? Did that make sense? What I just said?
It sounds like someone let the genie out of the lamp, and now they're trying to mitigate. It's different to apply it to cultural theory, and it's very different when that transforms into politics, which is even more terrifying than culture. And from the perspective of someone who can understand both, from this quote, I can understand how the community needs to start advising caution with these general theories that most people don't understand. Science. Redacted, as Joachim said.
Any other comments on it? Yeah, no, I think that's right. It does have the kind of flavour of firefighting, doesn't it, in a way?
Yeah, without refuting it and without it's advising caution on others.
I mean, why I chose these quotes is because what I find quite interesting is that Hegel is quite cautious around the idea that the life sciences can be applied simplistically to social and political life, and yet, in his own work, he's doing a lot of that. So he seems to be on a meta level, sort of arguing for caution. But he doesn't seem to be, but in his own work, he is certainly arguing along those lines, I would say. I'm just going to, does anyone else want to comment on this? Just
how does this, can you say anything about how this relates to, so this, around this time, Dilthey is already writing about Natur und Geschichte. So that's already quite a well-established idea that of course comes out of Hegel, but Hegel is by then forgotten, as it were. But so it seems to me that is somehow in the background here. Natur explanation of nature versus interpretation, understanding of history. He uses the word history there as well. Is there any kind of, do you see any kind of relevance of that?
Possibly. I mean, what this is, the text that this comes from is responding to his teacher, Rudolf Virchow, who was also the Minister for Public Education, Minister for Volksbildung, who was actually advocating something in practical terms, something quite close to what Hegel was pointing to here, for more natural scientific education in schools and so on. And the reception of that by, this sort of contemporary reception of that went rather far in the direction of, okay, we can just simply teach science and that's enough, yeah? And I think Hegel is actually responding to that. So it's not enough just to teach the natural sciences as if we will only, that's all we need, and then we can manage society and cultural life based on that. So I think that he's pulling back from that more extreme view in this text. That's how I sort of understand it. Not so much as a kind of conceptual conversation with hermeneutics or something, but there may be that in the background as well.
These images, did you say that he drew them himself?
Yeah, they're from Kunstformen der Natur.
Yeah, it's amazing.
They are really exceptionally beautiful, and the title really says it all, art forms of nature. This is his conception of what the natural world is, and of course that idea of the aesthetic as part and parcel of ecology continued to influence German ecology and Mobius's work and Buxtehude's work and so on. Okay, so we're about halfway through, so I do want to get to looking at Schnapsel, but if people are okay, we can continue to talk through the Hegel and Volkmann stuff. So Hegel had an ambivalent relationship himself to socialism, social democracy. He was not a social democrat himself, and he in fact argued, as these quotes show, both of them in fact, that based on Darwin's theory, well, I'll just let people read, why don't we read the left-hand one first? So he says, Darwin's selection theory, so the theory of evolution through sexual selection, is closely connected with biological laws of the division of labour. It's not a democratic but an aristocratic principle. Increasing inequality of people and their conditions of life is a necessary consequence of culture. I also consider the utopian goals of social democracy to be unrealisable and their ideal state of the future to be one great workhouse. However, that can't hinder me from recognising the justified core of that great social movement. Okay, so that last bit, so anyway, the first part speaks for itself. He thinks that when we think about social life as based on biological principles, we have to say that it is a question of the survival of the fittest and those who are in power being justified as being in power because they've been naturalistically selected to be, let's say. Okay, so that's very problematic. This idea that can't prevent me from seeing the justified core of the great social movement, that comes from, interestingly, his reading of Bebel, Die Frau und der Sozialismus. So he was quite impressed with that work. in which Babel, as many of you in the room will know, argues that the position of women in society is doubly oppressed, once on account of their gender or their sex, and second time on account of their economic subjugation. And so, anyway, Hegel was impressed with Babel's argument there, and he sort of saw that as making a strong case for the socialist cause. So this little caveat comes from that, but as we can see, it's certainly not a socialist perspective, and I think that in the excerpt from Freie Wissenschaft, that's even stronger. Der Darwinismus sei alles andere eher als sozialistisch. So it's everything else but socialist. Darwinism is everything but socialist. And then he says at the end there, selection theory teaches that in human life, as in animal and plant life, only a small favoured minority exists everywhere and at all times, can exist and flourish, while the great majority is spoiled and more or less destroyed, promptly destroyed in the struggle for life. So that, I think, makes his perspective on this quite clear. And in fact, maybe this is the more convincing sort of, maybe this is more compelling, gives us more compelling arguments for thinking about Hegel as a social Darwinist, right? This is kind of the idea at the core of social Darwinism, I would say, or one of the ideas. That said, so despite the fact that he was not himself a socialist, his work enjoyed a pretty lively reception on the liberal, socialist, social democratic and anarchist left. This article here in German gives a nice, quite comprehensive overview of that. So if anyone's interested, it's not easy to get hold of, so if anyone's interested in having a copy of that, I can send that to you, because I got it by document delivery, so I've got one. So we know that Marx and Engels engaged with Hegel. We read a section from the Dialectics of Nature, in which he even mentions him a couple of weeks ago, and their reception of him was, I think it's fair to say, quite ambivalent. They saw him on the one hand as the sort of, middle-class culmination of a naive materialistic view of the world that had kind of begun with the scientific materialists. On the other hand, they were also, as we saw as well, enthusiastic Darwinists themselves to a degree, and they saw in those aspects of Hegel's work they were engaged a bit more positively with. The Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte and the Welträtsel in particular were very popular titles in workers' libraries. So in a lot of workers' libraries, popular biology texts came quite high up the pecking order when it came to books that workers took out. So Woman Under Socialism, Babel's book, was usually quite high as well, and then sort of next came one of Hegel's titles, usually, if you look at the borrowing records for those kinds of libraries. And these texts went through multiple editions, so that's another way in which he was received by them. He was also favourably viewed by some socialist scientists at the time, so particularly Edward Aveling and Arnold Dodel, who was a botanist, but also by kind of rank-and-file party theorists and activists. So in Weber's article, he looks at copies of the Neue Zeit, in which multiple interlocutors are sort of engaging with Hegel, and sometimes more critically and sometimes more appreciatively, but in any case, not recognising him as a kind of Darwinist prophet, essentially. And I mean that in the sense in which Carolina said earlier, so Darwin just as a natural scientist, and the natural scientific view being sort of something that was seen as rational and progressive. And then just to brief comment, which is to say that Heinrich Schmidt, who was Haeckel's personal secretary and looked after his estate after his death, was initially a member of the SPD, as was Schaxel, who we'll come to. But then, after Haeckel's death, Schmidt did become a National Socialist. So that's just a kind of anecdotal thing that's potentially important. So there are two left-wing writers that I wanted to look at who engaged with Haeckel's work and took it in their own direction. One is Schaxel, who we'll come to in a moment, and the other is Ludwig Woltmann, who people may or may not have heard of. He was a zoologist, an anthropologist, and a Marxist theorist. He was also a member of the SPD for several years. These are some of the titles of his works, the significant ones for us. Let's just say one there. Darwinian Theory and Socialism, and that's the one that I gave an excerpt from. He also wrote a book on a sort of historical overview of the development of Marxist theory, Political Anthropology, which he published in 1903, and this was a work, and this is quite important, I'll say a little more about this in a moment, but this is really a turning point in Woltmann's thinking. He was a social Darwinist in the most sort of difficult of ways, but political anthropology was where he really became, tried to sort of combine Marxism with racial science. And he submitted that book to a prize competition that was set up by the Krupp Foundation. And the question, I don't have it here, the question was, in what way does Darwin's theory of descent, can it be used to explain social and political phenomena, essentially? That was the prize question, set up by the Krupp Foundation. And Woltmann entered this book, Political Anthropology, an investigation on the influence of descendants theory on the doctrine of the political development of peoples, to that competition, and he won third prize, which was given out by a committee, or the prize giving committee included Haeckel. Woltmann wasn't happy with third prize, he thought he should have done better, and so he kind of got himself involved in a diatribe against the prize giving committee and all sorts of things like that. But essentially, in his early writings, so up to the Political Anthropology, Woltmann tried to combine Marxism and Darwinism of the Hegelian kind of variety, but in a way that was, let's say, very unique and not straightforwardly social Darwinist as his later work would become. So he disagreed with Haeckel. He was quite ambivalent on this question of, can we just use biology to explain social human behaviour? At one point in the Die Darwinsche Theorie, he disagrees with Haeckel that, so this quotation from, exactly this quotation, he quotes that in full, so the section about we shouldn't apply biological theories directly to the political realm. In Die Darwinsche Theorie, Woltmann quotes this passage in full and disagrees with it. He says, this is not tenable, like obviously there are physiological explanations for social and political phenomena. But elsewhere in that same book, in fact in the same chapter that I put up online, he also makes the opposite point. So he's conflicted about this himself, even in the early years. So he says elsewhere that only bourgeois Darwinists seek to apply evolutionary theory wholesale to society. So he's distancing himself from that. He defends a version of communism. So Woltmann was a member of the SPD and he's close to Edward Bernstein, so the revisionist Eisenach kind of socialism, that was seen as more, that was seen by radicals as a kind of more of a capitulation to sort of bourgeois ideology that defended private property in certain circumstances and so on. And in this book, Volkmann defends a version of communism where he says, okay, Marx never says that communism is about full equality between people. Marx writes, that in communism, the economy will be governed according to the principle of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. This is not, Volkmann says, an egalitarian claim. This is a claim that recognises the individuality of each person. And therefore, his argument goes, communism would actually be the realisation of individualism, right? And he connects this to Darwinian theory. So he says Darwinian theory is compatible with Marxism precisely because it's about the struggle of the individual for their existence. And, that as puzzling as Bash is also puzzled by that argument, and it is a puzzling argument, but this is the argument he makes. He argues in the Die Darwinsche Theorie, again here in the beginning, he argues for a racial hierarchy, and his language gives, or also at various places, lets us know that that's how he thinks about human beings. But he nevertheless makes the claim that there's only one human species and that we're all essentially the same. So again, there's some confusion there in his claims. He also makes the point, and this is interesting for your interests, Carolina, as well, that against these putative bourgeois social Darwinists, he says that the struggle for existence in human society is not simply the same as that in the animal world. Why? Because animals wage this battle for existence purely on the basis of things with which they are organically endowed, with their bodies essentially and their physical characteristics. Human beings compete with each other and struggle with each other also via inorganic means. So he names technology, but he also names institutions and cultural practices and these kinds of things. So he uses that argument to distinguish between the two spheres. So this is his position in the early years. The reason why I think he abandons this position and moves towards a much more strongly hierarchical, borderline kind of aristocratic vision of society is quite simply because his ideas didn't really gather much support among social democrats. Yeah, so he eventually left the party in the early 20th century. He was arguing for the superiority of European groups, and even among pro-colonial socialists, they didn't buy it, a lot of them. So he just didn't really get much support. And so I think that he threw his dummy out and decided to go full social Darwinist. And in politische anthropology, that's what we see. He does adopt a much more reactionary position. And this is just an excerpt from the introduction to that book, Politische Anthropologie, which is not particularly extreme, but it just kind of gives a flavour of what he is talking about there. So,
Did you get more follow-up after that?
He started a journal. So he started a journal in 1902 called Politisch Anthropologische Revue, which ran until his death in 1907. And he was the editor, and the tenor of the journal was strongly influenced by his editorial line. But he did, the contributions were all in kind of moving in this same direction, right? The kind of, political anthropology is, I guess, does what it says on the tin. It's about describing distinctions between human societies based on anthropological factors. And as many of us in the room may know, in the German-speaking world, this word anthropological has a biologistic connotation that it doesn't necessarily have in English. So yes, I mean, he had a kind of community when he made that. He had more of a following and more of a community, but it was also quite self-curated because he was the prime mover of this journal. Just give you a minute to finish reading that. So here, I mean, just to kind of he's talking about an investigation, the influence of theory of dissent on on political theory. That last paragraph, for any non-German readers in the room, he says, the biological history of the human races, in plural, is the true and foundational history of states. Instead of this, up to now, one has almost exclusively made the development of political institutions and ideas in a one-sided way the object of historical investigations, while almost completely forgetting the real human beings themselves, the leibhaftig, so the sort of corporeal races, families and individuals as organic creators and bearers of political and intellectual history, spiritual history. So there we see much more clearly how extreme his views do go later on. So that's one image of the way in which Hegel gets taken up in Germany. And Schaxel is another, but does anybody have any last comments on that before we move on? Okay, so Volkmann was not a student of Hegel, so he never studied with him. He just was, he engaged with his work. Julius Schaxel was Hegel's last student. He was the last sort of PhD that he trained. He worked in the Jena laboratory with Ernst Haeckel initially. That's where he trained. And he also worked after his doctorate in Jena as well. He was a member of the Social Democratic Party from 1918 onwards, essentially, and he was also for a period Minister for Volksbildung, so in popular education, in the German state of Thuringia. In 1924, he set up this popular scientific magazine called Urania, which was explicitly targeted at social democrats and workers, and it was meant to sort of be a rival publication to the publication which some people know for Cosmos, which had been set up by Alexander von Humboldt initially, this book series and periodical, which Schaxel and some others saw as sort of too bourgeois, not really focused enough on natural science as a tool for social emancipation. So Urania was set up to fill that niche in the market as they perceived it. He published a lot in that journal. He also collaborated with David Ryazanov on the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe project, so he visited the Soviet Union a couple of times to work on that before eventually actually being exiled in the Soviet Union. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, he went into exile first in Switzerland and then in the Soviet Union, where he got a job at the Institute for Evolutionary Morphology at the Academy of Sciences, and he remained there until his death, I think. Again, he wrote a lot of, especially in his early career, he published a lot of significant natural scientific articles, but these books which were all came out with the Urania Verlag, which was a publishing house for books, were his most important ones. So, Entwicklung der Wissenschaft vom Leben, das Geschlecht, und das Weltbild der Gegenwart und seine gesellschaftlichen Grundlagen. So, Schaxel is a trained biologist, so that's a slightly different perspective from Woltmann, for example. But he is also working with philosophical concepts, and I think that comes out pretty strongly in this piece that we read for today. So the piece that I picked out was actually originally published in Urania, and it's an article called Das biologische Individuum, the biological individual. And it's a sort of, I guess I would characterize it as a sort of philosophy of science piece in which Schaxel is, as a biologist, but also from a philosophical perspective, reflecting on this concept of individuality in biology and in the world more broadly. So, Giza, have you got access to that? Yeah, you have, good. And everybody else, I've got a paper copy here that someone can have. Does anyone need that? You happy? Okay. So I just put up a few questions that I thought might help us to sort of read this together and understand it. I'll put my cards on the table and say I would not describe Schaxel as a social Darwinist, and I think it would be difficult to extract that reading from this text, certainly. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about what we think his argument is here. To what extent can his vision of the natural world, including, of course, the human world, be considered monistic in the sense of Hegel? So there's a monistic philosophy. What is Schaxel's relation to Engels and dialectical materialism? So how does he relate to that, and how does he relate to Darwinian theory? And then just a broader question, I guess, how does he draw on science, on biology to make a social or political point, and is it convincing? So maybe we can just start by talking about what he's actually saying here in this text. I don't need to look at that. What about if we just briefly look at the structure? So right at the very beginning, we've got a little table of contents for the article. What is that? Does anyone have any comment about that? We've got an Einleitung, and then we've got the first part called Die allgemeine Relativität der Bionten, the general relativity of bionta, like biota. No, because biota is a collective noun, isn't it? Living beings. Then the second part, the special relativity of living beings, and that's subdivided into several sections: the historical resolution, the genetic resolution, the formal resolution, the social resolution, and then the third part, individuality and dialectics.
What is that? What is this opposition allgemein speciaal? What does it mean?
That's a good question.
Does it mean allgemein speciaal? Does that mean historical, genetic, formal, social?
Well, yeah, those are the subdivisions of that category, special relativity.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, okay, so first of all, general
Yeah.
relativity and special relativity, they are Einsteinian terms.
Exactly. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, sounds familiar. I mean, I'm not sure what we need to say more about that just now, but it's certainly positioning him in a particular discourse, right? That one might want to say gives the idea that there are sort of laws or something, perhaps. I don't know, just making a comment. This word, beyond. So we were talking about this briefly beforehand, and I only know, I've only come across that word in Wilhelm Reich's work, where he uses it to describe a putative fundamental microorganism or something, which is more like a speculative concept, almost like a Leibnizian monad, sort of. Has anyone, Giza, do you know that word at all? Is it?
No, I hadn't really heard it before. It kind of made sense, like immediately in the context I was like, that is an interesting concept, but
Yeah.
it actually reminded me a little bit of like from Deleuze and Guattari's with somatic structures.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I had never heard it before.
No. Well, maybe I'll do a bit more digging, but I get the sense that this is his neologism, so he's sort of, yeah.
So Reich uses exactly the same word.
Yeah, he does.
Same okay.
Yeah, but I don't know when Reich first uses that concept.
Right.
It doesn't mean quite the same as what I think Shaxler is using it to mean here. I think for Shaxler it's just like a synonym of organismus. Yeah.
But like a specific one, no? Like maybe like it's an organism with like open kind of borders, no?
Well, but I think he's saying that that's what all organisms are.
Yeah,
Right.
of course. But I guess he does need to, or at least feels the need to come up with a new word that wouldn't refer to an organism as, maybe, this is just like a far stretch, but maybe he does have in mind this, all those metaphors of an organism, of a social organism that already needs a closed
Self-regulating system. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think
He does talk about the need to think organisms as historical progressions and kind of reform that term from it meaning this set scholastic category. And so I thought as well that he used specifically the word that was not organism to clarify that development.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
But he gets it from or at least he gets it from Hegel.
Oh, does he?
Yeah, if I'm correct, on page 471, he quotes Hegel, and he says, im Laufe der Darlegung sieht sich Hegel gezwungen, einen neuen Begriff einzuführen, der Beweglichkeit der Lebensvorgänge gerecht zu werden. Das physiologische Individuum, Bion, ist eine einzelne organische Raumgröße, welche als zentralisierte Lebenseinheit der Selbsterhaltung fähig und zugleich teilbar ist und welche Wege der mit dieser Funktion verbundene Bewegung nur als eine in verschiedenen Zeitmomenten veränderliche erkannt werden kann.
I think I must have missed that, or either that, or thought that was his assertion.
His assertion, yeah. Could be, but we have to check it.
I now think that, look, it's between, it's in the quote, so yeah.
So it's kind of you can have bions you can have them at different levels of organizational complexity. You can have really simple ones and you can have really complex ones, but they have a kind of individuality or independence which links them to the Aristotelian concept of substance or individual organism. It's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's not tied to this, like you say, the scholastic metaphysics. We want to avoid that. So that's why he uses that name. It's a physiological individual.
Yeah.
And therefore it's always temporary. It has to have temporal parts, and you can only get to know it in its movements. But that's very old. Thomas Aquinas says exactly the same thing about bodies, that you can only know them in their movements. That's a scholastic idea.
But he sees himself as in opposition to what he sees as the scholastic
Absolutely.
conception of the individual.
Totally. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so that notwithstanding, maybe he's wrong about that, but okay, good, well seen. So that whole first section is, but here in the, I mean, he's talking about, he's engaged in this dialogue with Aristotle and Darwin and Hegel, but he's talking about real empirical organisms, right, or bions. Dem empirischen Biologen, der durch Beobachtung und Versuch über das lebendige Erfahrungen sammelt, begegnet nirgends und niemals eine abgeschlossene, starre, kategorische Individualität. Yeah? So the experimental scientist never encounters a closed and fixed individual that just doesn't exist from the perspective of the biologist. So this allgemeine Relativität der Beyondten seems to me in this section like he's just basically making that point. Like natural science, life science doesn't know such a thing as a fixed and closed individual. Point.
Yeah.
And then what about the special relativity bit? What's he going on about here?
But wait a minute, sorry, if I understand it, my question about the general relativity is, so he says, well, everything is connected to everything else. There are no independent beings, substances that do not require an essential relation to others to exist. And he seems to suggest that is Aristotle's view. And so this general relativity points that out, but at the same time, and that's the point to the beyond, that's why it's a dialectical notion right from the start, at the same time the beyond is an individual. You can't just ad libitum divide nature up into what you want to be a beyond. So there are definite unities, only they are unities that exist only in relation to others.
Yes, exactly.
And science has the business of establishing what are these real beings.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yes, I think that's right. So,
and he seems to be steering towards the idea that therefore you need the dialectics of nature to understand this in itself paradoxical relationship between individual and relation.
definitely, yeah. So the beyond is a concept of the individual that is always in relation and can only be.
Yeah, but still an individual.
Yeah, so it's definitely, and obviously he's...
and that is precisely what for Aristotle was unthinkable.
Yeah.
Only, it's not entirely true, because for the scholastic traditions, although they say an individual person is a substance in the sense that they do not require something else, they are predicated of something. In black beauty, you predicate blackness of black beauty, but you don't predicate black beauty of something else. So therefore it's an individual. It's a substance, but that doesn't mean that that black beauty doesn't require food or air or a creator to be. So in that sense...
Oh, but we're talking about a fictional character, and then that's
a
whole other realm of fictional characters
Moir is the same thing.
Yeah, okay. Use me, that's more.
So you're not predicated of anything,
Yeah,
but we can predicate many things of you.
yeah,
So you are an individual, but that doesn't mean that you don't require anything else than you to be. So it's a...
well, I mean,
But I mean, maybe that's not so relevant.
it's tangential, I
Yeah,
think.
it's
regarding
tangential discussion, yeah.
the extent to which what he's saying Aristotle didn't see, he did already or not. I think that maybe is a little bit of a
Sure.
a side argument.
Okay.
So I think what's interesting about this transition, in the transition, before he goes on to the section on special relativity, he says, bions are processes of the living totality of living contexts that only appear in movement and in relation, never, however, as closed categories. Their becomeness allows for historical explanations. In this process of giving historical explanations, it's a matter not only of demonstrating the kind of broad lines or the broad arc of their history, but also their origin and the ways in which they are at work in individual situations. Bions become objects of experiments. They demonstrate they point in multiple directions beyond their immediate conditions towards contexts of varying scope. The transition from biology to sociology, the transitions from biology to sociology play a particularly important role in this. So he's already at that point situating the bion at the point of transition from biology to sociology. So even, the individual muscle in its, I'm just thinking of Carl Moebius's work on muscle pools, but Carl Moebius comes up with this term Biozenose, which is like we would today call it ecosystem, but that was the concept before the concept of ecosystem came into being, and Schaxel uses this term Biozenose. So anyway, and Moebius developed that concept by looking at little muscle beds, so mussels and what they eat and stuff. And even in that context, you've got a kind of proto-society, basically, is what I think the idea is here. And then he moves into talking about special relativity. And so the special relativity of bions, it seems to me, is all the ways in which, at that more complex level, they are in relation to one another and other things, right? So he's going to delineate those now. The historical resolution of the individual environment dichotomy and so on and so on. I think, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, what are these different resolutions of this dichotomy? And I think Johann's already made the point, and I'm sure it was clear to everybody reading this, that this is definitely a text that's sort of imbued with Engels's dialectical conception of nature. And that's where he wants to go. The Auflösung, yes, it's more like the dissolution rather than the resolution, the sort of dissolution of the concept of a fixed and closed individuality. That's a better book.
Yeah, exactly. So first he says, historically, every individual has a history. It can only be understood as a moment in coherent process of nature.
Yeah, in a history, in a coherent process of nature, and also in the evolution of a particular species. He says,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Because the way in which biomes are historically connected is because they are generated by their ancestors, and they generate themselves successors.
That's right.
And then between them you get inheritance.
Yeah, and then so that's the next
And that leads them to exactly. Yeah.
dissolution there. The genetic one, which is obviously totally connected to the previous one. What does that consist in?
It's interesting that at the historical dissolution, he actually does need the concept of the organism, or like maybe not I think he doesn't need it, but maybe he introduces it as a part, as exactly to specify it as a part of the historical progression and like emergence of different aggregations, and that an organism is like maybe a type of individuality that this is like on page.
Yeah, die Organismen sind Produkte historischer
Yeah.
Kumulation, he says, doesn't he? Yeah.
And then what he means by that, he says later, is that, from what I understood, that they're never complete in the moment. So that yes, maybe there is while looking at an organism, we need to also think of it as being in time. And as on one kind of level of the possible aggregation of living forms being together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that idea of one possible aggregation is also really important, because when he moves to, so that's a more general argument about temporality, and then he sort of moves down to the level of genetics. So how is this the case? How is it that organisms are just one moment, one possible aggregation in a temporal sense? Well, because of the genetic program that they possess and transmit. But he talks about Mendel. He also talks somewhere here about, from the perspective of contemporary biology, right? Mutation is a contingent process. So this idea of one possible aggregation, it's not just that organisms pass on data and replicate themselves on that basis, but there's also contingency built into that. So that's another important thing to take into account. And I think he mentions that somewhere, but I can't actually see now.
So he links it at the end of that section also to quantity, to the dialectic of quantity and quality.
On page 477.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which of course is a familiar dialectical principle from the logic, Hegels logic.
And what does he say about that?
Well, he seems to be saying that so of course this is all before DNA, so he knows that there are genes, but he thinks about them as stuff that you can have more or less, that you can have more or less of. Im genetischen Prozess werden die Effektqualitäten durch bestimmte dosierte Genquantitäten bedient. So in the genetic process, the effect qualities, the morphology of the individual is determined by a dosierte Genquantität, so specific measurements of or quantities of genes. Und damit die durch die Generation gehenden Abläufe, die das Mosaik des Artbildes in jedem Zeitpunkt ausmachen, eine Gesetzmäßigkeit angefügt. So with that you get a lawfulness in the way that the mosaic of the image of the species, so the presentation of the species, how it develops over time. So, for example, probably what he's thinking of is if you breed a dog or so, a species of dog or so, we have to have a white coat or whatever. Then
That you want more of
you get more of the white, and then so the next dog is more white than the previous one.
So he thinks it works by. He thinks that quality, the quantity of genes transmits into a certain kind of phenotypic quality, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's of course what exactly, and he links that to implicitly to Hegel's idea that quantity and quality quality is quality is intensity, and intensity can be expressed in terms of quantity, and so a higher temperature.
I wonder whether that was a common, like, I wonder how idiosyncratic that idea is to him, you know, at the time, prior to the discovery of DNA. Like, I actually don't know that.
No, I don't know that either.
But that would be really interesting to find out, because it sounds kind of crazy, but also the logic of it is plausible as well. So.
And it is a very Marxist idea to say 100 people is a demonstration, but 10,000 people is a revolution. So that's the use that Marx makes of this difference, or this relation.
Well, yeah. Also, I mean, Hegels in the Dialectic of Nature, where the classic example is the boiling point of water, right? You increase the temperature, and then you get a phase transition.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, yeah.
And so he seems to be saying then that the Overlösung here is that the individual at each moment in time in the development of the species shows up its qualities in accordance with these laws of genetic inheritance. That's the point, seems to me. Hier genügt uns die Feststellung der genetischen Auflösung der Individualität in einer Reihe nebeneinander gehender Abläufe, deren Resultante in jedem Zeitpunkt das ist, was wir Individuum nennen, und als Zustand eines Naturvorganges als Ausschnitt aus dem Zusammenhang, aus einer komplexen Relation begreifen, keineswegs aber als Dauer, die wir uns vorstellen müssen.
Yeah. Okay. What about the formal factor here? What does that consist in? So, in what way? What's his formal argument against fixed individuality?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Take care.
No more is it?
Huh?
What's the answer?
Well, I mean, someone else going to say something.
No, I was just going to point to because I haven't read the text before, so I'm just trying to locate the moment.
Sure.
And I think the first one is on 478 in the second full paragraph.
Yeah,
Right, so...
that's right. That's what I was going to point to as well.
Right, so I'm really unable to translate is on the same spot, but I guess the interesting thing here is that the cells he's mentioning as the individuality that he points to in this argument. That what kind of makes them unable, that he does have like this kind of weird twist to me here, that he says, well, I think the reason why they can't be considered closed individualities is because of like now I can't find it, but like some kind of a life force, no? Yeah, no. It's oh yeah, exactly. So it's in the next paragraph actually. So that they can't be considered individuality because like the life kind of flows through them, right? So through the forms.
Where does he say that? Because I was going to point to something else, but that's also...
Okay, it's the first sentence, die Zellen und Zellengebilde können nicht als abgeschlossene Individuen angesehen werden, denn gerade im Hinblick auf die Formel des Lebens in der fortgesetzten Abbildung der Individualform.
Which page is that? 478.
Yes, 478. 1, 2, third full paragraph down.
Die Zellengebilde. Yeah, exactly. That's a quick P passage.
I mean, I think what he starts to kind of get into here, and then he later develops as well with this idea of Furchung. And so you always have cells that then kind of grow and separate, and then you can't really distinguish anymore where they sort of end, because components of them just form new cells. And so there's just like this, what you were saying with the life force, it's just continuous principle of like growth and parting and reassembling, which to me essentially does sound like a metabolic process.
Yeah, and in fact his experiments with axolotls, was it? Axolotls. He publishes on that and gets into an argument with Hans Driesch about what was Hans Driesch's principle of... So Driesch tried to argue, and he was a vitalist, and he tried to argue that, I'm not going to get this entirely right now, but he made some sort of argument about the harmonious constitution of the individual that would always be reproduced. Like there's some kind of life force that would balance out damage or deformities of, no, that's what it is. Why does the axolotl grow its arm back? Because there's some kind of life force within it that knows how to replicate the arm or whatever. Yeah. And Schaxel said, and he makes somewhere there also to issue the argument about cells, that this works in a similar way. And Schaxel said, cells will only reproduce themselves as full individuals if they've got the composition of all the elements that were in the original cell. Yeah, so it's so he was engaged in an argument against Driesch's vitalism on this topic, which I haven't been able to summarise very clearly, but that's going on. So on the one hand, he's making quite an empirical biological argument about why axolotl body parts reproduce themselves, and he wants to say it's not due to some kind of vital force, like Driesch argues, but rather has to do with what the cells know in the body of the axolotl, what information they contain, that they're able to reproduce the limb that is cut off. And so that still enables him to maintain the argument that you both explained that he is committed to, right? That cells are not individuals because there is this sharing of information among them, which is something like, it's not a life force, he doesn't want to call it a life force, but it is that which sustains life across boundaries or whatever. I just wanted to make that point badly because you could think that he's talking about some kind of life force here in a vitalistic way, and I think he definitely does not see himself as doing that.
No.
I think there's another way in which this, so that's right, so this life that flows through the cells, as it were, which is information or whatever, is one way in which they're not individuals. But another way is that the cell is composed of multiple substances and components, he says there as well, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So he says, wir sprechen demgemäß von der Zusammengesetztheit, von der Konstitution der Zelle. So there are different parts to a cell, and I thought that was a really interesting argument given the way that the metaphor of the cell has often been used in, social discourse to talk about harmonious and closed whole as an individual that's made up, that's more than the sum of its parts. Here he's actually using that same image to say something different. We can't see the cell as an individual because it's dependent on, it is simply, what it is simply a composition of multiple chemicals and phenomena.
Which in this is just very unsurprisingly parallel construction to the historical argument that he just made. That is exactly the same but on a different, maybe more biological level. And I'm just wondering what kind of political consequences it could have.
Let's skip to that then. I mean, we don't need to finish. We're going to finish in a minute anyway.
Yeah, right.
That's the important point, I think.
Okay, then let's get to that.
No, let's. What do you think about it?
I don't know. I mean, it does seem like he doesn't really, because a historical perspective taken to a biological level can have, I guess, take to different roots, right? So it can be about the reproduction of life. Or it can also have a certain element of destruction that we have seen in Hegels, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think, I haven't done the text, so this is just a guess here, but it seemed that he didn't really mention the kind of destructive force of time, so to say, here. So I guess this goes well with the monistic vision in which there is, I guess, no destruction in terms of just the movement of matter. Mm-hmm. But then, on the other hand, Hegels did kind of was able to mention that what I thought was about the revolutionary force of a radical change of what already exists. And that, I don't know, that here it seems like there is no possibility of this radical, that maybe it's a reformist kind of monism.
Yeah. I don't know, I genuinely don't know whether I think that or not yet. But, I mean, he does say on page 490, mit der Arbeit beginnt die Herrschaft der Menschen über die Natur. Sie sondert die Menschen vom Tier und führt sie zur Wirtschaft. So that's entirely Engels' point, right? The labour theory revolution. Once you've got 490 down towards the bottom, it's the penultimate sentence. It's the third from the bottom.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So with work, human beings conquer nature, and this, namely work, distinguishes the human being from the animal and leads it to the economy, and that's,
But I thought in a really interesting dialectical move, then it is exactly that Arbeitsteilung, which then moves society back closer to this whole idea of interconnected organisms again, right? Because then he again applies this principle of a certain quantity leads to a change in quality, because if you have a society that becomes so complex and so intermingled and has so many separate parts working together, then a new quality of society develops, and one that is both as individualistic, because at some point the individual ceases to be able to exist on its own when it's so bound up in this society. And at the same point in time, it is kind of, it returns to this sort of biological principle in a way.
I think that's right, and I think he is only trying to very light. I think he's trying to make only a very light political point here in the end. Like, I don't think he's. I think he's trying. My view of what this text is a sort of philosophy of science approach to the idea of the individual that tries to show how it's untenable. In order to, make use of it for, so it's kind of a propadoitic, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It feels to me like it's doing that work. On 491 he says, immer zeigt sich die Vergesellschaftung der Vereinzelung gegenüber Überlegen. So the socialization and the fact of being in relation to other things is always superior, demonstrates itself as always. He says überlegen, which obviously has a qualitative tone, but I think also just, he seems to me to mean here just also more important than in the biological realm, right? It's being in relation to something else is always more, takes priority over individuation. And I think this is definitely an exercise in dialectical biology, as he calls it. So it's a way of thinking about the biological realm that is dialectical and helps us to, break down some of those seemingly fixed categories. But it would have been nice to reflect on maybe more on where that might go politically, and perhaps we can do that over drinks.
Smooth.
Yeah. I was going to say next week. next week, we're moving on to, and it is connected because we're going to read Gustav Landauer's translation of Peter Kropotkin's book on mutual aid, in which Kropotkin makes precisely that argument that mutualism and cooperation are just as much evolutionary forces as competition. And Jan and I were just chatting about this before this session, but I have to dig a little bit more to find out the exact genealogy of this, but I do know that that book did have feedback impact on the theory of the study of mutualism and behavioural ecology and things like that. So it might be interesting to think about that.
We stop now.
Is anyone interested in sausages?